The following program is rated T for teen for the use of tools and materials that can be harmful to unsupervised usage. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello everyone, Mr. Waugh here from Mr. Waugh Media, and yes, that is my actual name. On today's episode, we're going to make some dungeon accessories. On one of the last episodes, we made these dungeon tiles, and since then, I've expanded the collection. In fact, I've done entire rooms now. You'll notice the technique is pretty much exactly the same. Same walls, same floors, just on a much larger surface. But at the same time, it's kind of empty. It's kind of like an orc skull. There's nothing in there. So I decided, why don't we try to expand and use some accessories? So I made stuff like this. A little crystal shrine. I've got some animal dens, some doors, even a stairwell that leads to another level. On that note, let's see how we actually built these. Alright, for our first piece, we're going to work on the crystal shrine. For this one, I'm going to mark it out 3 inches by 3 inches on the 1/2 inch thick styrofoam sheet. Now, remember when you're making your cuts, don't do one long pull. This can always damage the material. Make multiple, lighter, small cuts. Once I've got that done, I'm going to chop off the corner pieces and hold on to these little bits. For one, it makes it easier to measure out and make sure all the others are clean, but we're also going to need them when we do our animal den project a little bit later on. With that out of the way, we're now going to take our pen and try to draw a line all the way through it as clean as I can. We're going to make this whole thing about 2 bricks tall when it's all said and done. Once I got that out of the way, I'm going to take my ruler and try to make a frame along the edges, maybe a few centimeters in depth. I'm going to try to do this as clean as I can. I'm freestyling a little bit here. If you want to take the time to measure, then go for it. Just remember, if you start making any marks in the styrofoam, it will be permanent. Next up, we're going to draw thin lines from the edge of the frame all the way to the edge of the piece. And then in between them, we'll try to make it about 3 bricks wide. The corner pieces will be about 2 bricks. This will give us a nice pattern to work with, and it should be relatively uniform. From here, if you want to start drawing ruins into each of the bricks, that's totally up to you how detailed you want this to go. For me, I'm going to keep it relatively simple and straightforward to sort of match the surroundings of the dungeon, but as I've said several times, it's as complicated as you want to make it, and all the power too if you decide to go and do massive detail work along each and every brick. Once the base is firmly out of the way, we're now going to move on to the crystal. For this one, I'm using a piece of styrofoam that I had that was 1 inch thick, but if you don't have something like that laying around, just glue 2 halfers together. With that, I'm going to chop off the top parts of this to give it more of a ragged, randomized kind of look. How much detail you put in the crystal is totally up to you. If you want multiple small pieces that look like jagged shards of crystals, that can look kind of cool. If you want a solid slab of a monolith, that's a different direction you could take it as well. For me, I'm going to try to make it a almost stereotypical what you would imagine a crystal would look like. It's not going to be overly complicated, but it's going to be, identifiable as soon as you see the piece. With those 2 parts out of the way, we're now going to move on to the front altar. This isn't very complicated. We're just going to take a piece of styrofoam and chop it up multiple times until it fits just right in front of the crystal. For the next part, we're going to work on the more complicated piece for this crystal shrine, the spellbook that's going to sit on the altar. Now to do this one, you're going to take a couple strips of paper, about, I want to say maybe 1/2 inch long, and I found 4 is about the right thickness. You can of course add more if you want to try to make it look a little bit more realistic, but I find at that point it's a little bit thicker, a little bit more tricky to work with. I'm just going to trim it down here until it's about the size of a fingernail. Your hand size may vary, of course. But once I have that out of the way, I'm going to use this strip of cardboard to make the outer binding for the book. Now, this is kind of a neat little thing that I saw from Mia, actually. One of her friends makes little custom jewelry pieces, and I think it was a pair of earrings that were miniature spellbooks. So I was looking at that, trying to figure out how I could reverse engineer it, and I came up with this. It's not very time consuming, you just got to be a little bit more precise with this, and I think it looks pretty cool overall. Once you slice it down to the measurements that you want, I'm going to take these pliers. I'm going to press gently into the spine. It just gives it a really cool effect. It gives it that really old wizard book kind of vibe. So I quite like this. Just don't go too hard. You don't want to damage it. And there you have it, our little spell book. If you want, you could add little writings in there if you have a fine enough pen. And I'm just going to add a little bit of glue into the spine and put the pages in. And it'll soak right through, it'll bind the entire thing together, and it's relatively durable. So, voila, we have our miniature spellbook. For our next accessory, we're going to make a small stairwell that'll insert into the previously designed dungeon tiles. For this one, I'm going to chop it out 2 inches wide by about 3 inches long. The idea is that the bottom layer is going to be 3 inches, next one will be 2 inches, and the top will, well, you can probably guess, 1 inch. I'll run a line in between all of them, and I'm trying to make some sort of basic brick pattern. This is a very straightforward piece, like I'm not going into anything very complicated for this one. It's a generic insert. It's so generic that I'm struggling to make this somewhat interesting in my voiceover here. It's literally just me stacking bricks. Thrilling! Yeah, so, how's everyone's quarantine going? For me personally, I'm slowly slipping further into insanity. But, you know, it's all good. It's all good. Ooh, look, I'm making a cut. Ooh, exciting. Thrilling! God, I need a life. Oh, look, I'm using hot glue. Exciting. So exciting! Oh, that's hot. I'm sorry. Okay, this next accessory is a little bit more in-depth, so I can actually try to be a bit more professional. I'm going to start making a door here. It's going to be about 2 inches tall, and I'm going to put it on a 1/2 inch base. For this one, I'm just going to measure it out with some generic cardboard sheets here, and once I have that out of the way, we're going to start working on the planks. So for this one, I'm taking the coffee stir sticks and breaking them off as clean as I can, 2 inches. So for this one, stockpile a few. It probably takes about, I want to say, maybe 6 or 7 wide per side. And then from there, we're going to just mount them in place. Whatever kind of glue you want to use. I'm going to use the hot glue gun here. You could use white glue, gives you a little bit more time to work with. You could use the super glue, whatever your poison is. I'm just going to slap that on there, as you can see here. And once that side's done, I would obviously go on to the other. For this tutorial, I'm just going to do the one side, just to make this as quick as I can. But yeah, just trim off any of the excess pieces. There's obviously going to be a few splinters left over, so just go nice and clean with the knife. And then we're going to hot glue this to the base itself, like so. Once that's done, here, I'll just give it a little close-up. You know, not overly complicated, you know, that's just some wooden panels. If you want to go a little bit more in-depth, though, what we're going to do is break off some pieces. These are 2 inches wide, just like the door itself. I don't know if I actually said that in the beginning or not. Oh, well. So I'm just going to slice it in half, and then I'm going to glue it at the top and the bottom just to make it look a little bit interesting, like that. For our last piece, we're going to work on the animal den. For this one, I'm going to measure it 3 inches by 2 inches, and I'm going to draw a curved line between the two, which I'll then try to cut as clean as I can here. Now, since I'm working with 1/2 inch thick, I'm going to make a second piece, because I want this to be about 1 inch tall. Once I have that cut out as well, I'll do the same with a piece of cardboard just to give myself a bit of a stable base. Once I have all 3 pieces, we're going to mount them all together with the hot glue gun. And make sure you use a pretty generous layer of glue because we will be cutting through here and we want to make it as solid as possible. So I'm going to take my X-Acto blade here, make sure it's nice and sharp, and then I'm going to cut it at an angle to round out all the edges. I'm going to make it jagged and sort of randomized. I'm going to even trim a little bit off the top, maybe about 1/4 inch or so. The whole idea behind this is it's a random animal's been burrowing through its mounds of earth and stone. So we want to keep it randomized. We want to make it look crude. And then in the very middle of it, I'm going to take a sharp X-Acto blade here, a very fine blade. I'm going to start digging into it. Right, and this is going to be about, I want to say in total, the width of your pinky. As you can see here, I'm just sort of drilling in there. And since this is 2 inches wide, I'm going to go about 1 inch in. That way we have enough material to work with to really give it the depth that an animal has been, burrowing through here. Once that's out of the way, we're going to take those corner pieces from the crystal shrine that we kept, and we're going to mount them all over this piece. I'm going to do a little bit more brickwork here and there, and I'm going to mount them, some in the front, some on top, some to the side here, to really give it, again, that random element of an animal just bursting through the wall, and it's just showering earth everywhere in these mounds. And if you have some accessories too, like maybe some skeletons from a miniature range, some skulls, some remains of bodies, you can scatter those around. That'd certainly be very suitable for a savage animal's den. With the construction now out of the way, we're going to apply some white glue across the outer surface, make sure not to get any on the bricks, and we're going to also put it inside the hole itself. This is, after all, a earthy kind of burrow, and we're just going to sprinkle that across the entire surface here, tap off the excess, and there we go, our animal den. With construction now out of the way, we're going to start painting. We're going to do a generous coat of black acrylic paint as our primer, and we're going to slap it on all 4 pieces. Make sure you get it into all the nooks and crannies here, and give it plenty of time to dry. Now, if you have seen my previous episodes on ruins, on the dungeon tutorial, and even the panel episode, you're going to find a lot of similarities between those ones and this episode. It's kind of the staple of what I do. So, we're going to give ample time for all of this black primer to dry, and then we're going to take 3 parts black to 1 part white to make a nice dark gray color. And we're going to apply that pretty generously across all of the stone elements. So we got the stairwell here, we'll do the crystal shrine, and we'll do the remnants of the animal den where there's little bits of brick sticking out. We'll give this layer a lot of time to dry as well, because in the next one, we're going to do 1 part black, 1 part white, and do a lighter dry brush across all of the stone elements. Make sure you alternate your brush strokes just to make it a little bit interesting with the patterns, especially if you do multiple layers with this. It just makes the bricks a little bit more interesting. Once that's all dried, we'll take 1 part black to 3 parts white this time, and we'll dry brush it across all the stone elements. You'll notice I'm doing a little bit more of the brush stroking in different directions, and I'm also focusing along the edges. This is just a nice way to highlight them and just gives it a little bit more pop. For the next step, we're going to take some pure white and remove almost all of the paint from the bristles. And I'm going to focus quite heavily along the edges and of course doing my cross brushes across all the stone surfaces. Once I'm done the stairwell, the crystal shrine, and the den, we'll move on to the other colors. The next layer is going to be relatively straightforward. We're just going to take some Agrax Earthshade from Citadel paints and apply a generous layer across all of the surfaces. Now, if you don't happen to have this one, you can make your own using some blacks and some browns and heavily diluting the paints down. Just make sure you get into all the cracks and spread it evenly. For the other 2 pieces, we're now going to start working with the brown colors. I'll take 1 part black and 1 part brown to make this nice dark chocolate tone, and I'll apply it over the entire piece minus the bricks which I previously was working on. When it comes to the door panel, we're going to go side to side with our dry brushing and just give it a nice quick coat. We're going to repeat the entire process, but this time instead of the dark chocolate, we're going to switch to a generic brown. And I'm going to apply that not quite as heavy as the previous layer. This is going to be more of a lighter dry brush. Make sure not to get it on the stones too much, but if you do, not too big of a deal. When it comes to the door panel, same technique, side to side, and make sure I cover it evenly. Next up, we're going to take 1 part brown to 1 part golden yellow to make this nice sand color. I'm going to dry brush that evenly across the entire surface, once again, being very careful not to get on the stone, but don't sweat the small stuff if you do. It is, after all, a nasty dungeon. For the door panels, same technique, side to side, no surprise there, and it's coming together. While the paint's still wet on my palette, I'm going to add a little bit of white to the mix to make an even lighter sand color. This is going to be a very light dusting across the entire surface of both the den and the door. I decided to quickly go back in and do an extra layer of white across all the bricks. After I used the Agrax Earthshade, I found it went a little bit too dark for my liking and it was looking a bit too much like the ground. So just going back in, touching it up a bit just to make a nice distinction. Once I'd given that enough time to dry, I just went back in with a little bit more Agrax Earthshade to darken up the stones a bit, and this time I think it looks a little bit better. Now, once that's out of the way, I'm going to take my Agrax Earthshade once again and apply it across the entire door to give some nice shadows in between the wood grains. we're now going to tackle the Crystal Shrine. And this glowing effect I'm about to teach you, you can use for a couple different colors. Primarily, it works really good for blues and greens. In theory, you can get away with yellow a little bit. Red, not so much. The whole idea is you take your primary color, in this case blue, and you'll continually dry brush the surface with increasing amounts of white in the mix until you're basically working with pure white along the highlights. So you can imagine with the green, you're getting the same effect. It's that dark green, normal green, a little bit lighter. Same with the blues. The yellows, you just keep adding white to the mix. Problem is, if you try that with the reds, you're going to get, red and white equals pink, so you don't quite have the same kind of technique. Purple's okay, I find. But when it comes to reds, you almost need to work with oranges and yellows to get the lighter effects, and that's kind of a video for another time. And this whole time, as you can see in the background, I've been adding a little bit more white to the mix gradually. I'm dusting the entire surface lighter and lighter with my dry brushing, and I'm especially focusing on the edges, the more white that I'm adding to the mix. And we're just going to keep going like this until we get the crystal looking just right. And that's totally a you choice. For me, I think I'm going to finish off this layer, and that's probably going to be it. So on that note, let's take a look at what we constructed. First up, we have our stairwell. This was quick and easy to build, took maybe 5 minutes in total, and since we matched the color palette to the dungeon tile episode, it slots in nice and easy. Now we could have easily done a little bit more brickwork, a big archway or whatever, but for what it is, I like it. Next up, we have our animal den, and I've added a little bit of blood effect around the surface there with some red paints. Makes it look like you drag some poor unfortunate soul into its lair, and it slots nicely into the corner pieces of the larger rooms. Corridors, not so much, a little bit tight. And next up, we have our doors. I think this looks really cool. I made about 6 or 7 of them for my dungeon, and I did some different patterns with the door frames. I added a little bit of sand on some of the bottoms to try to make it blend in a little bit better. Overall, I think these turned out great, and it took maybe a couple minutes to make them each. Last but not least, we have our Crystal Shrine. I really like this piece. I think it looks really cool. And you'll notice I did a little bit of highlighting with some generic brown along the edge of the book just to make it pop out a little bit more. There's actually some writing in the pages with a very fine pen. Overall, I love this piece. Alright, well that's been today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, maybe found some useful information. If you did, make sure you hit the like, share, subscribe down below, and share it with all your friends. We're really trying to build this one up. Now, if there's anything you want me to build on a future episode, put it down in the comments below, and maybe I can build something for you guys. On that note, I've been Mr. Waugh from Mr. Waugh Media. I hope you were thoroughly entertained. We'll catch you on the next one. Am I here for